Hey everybody, this week we are going to finish up World War I. We're going to talk about the Russian Revolution, which happens towards the end of World War I, and then we're going to discuss the peace treaty signed at Versailles in 1919, which wraps all of this up. Kind of have a lot to cover here, but I'll try to move as quickly as I can so I don't bog you down too much. So in my previous lecture, I discussed the enormous human toll of the First World War. We talked about Verdun, we talked about the Somme, we talked about just these almost unbelievable casualty numbers coming from the Western Front, 10 million dead, 20 million wounded, a generation of men completely lost, and those who were not lost completely broken. The collapse of governments across Europe, a widespread sense of disillusionment, but that was largely focusing on military aspects of the war. So today I want to just talk a little bit more about what's happening on the so-called home front. Remember, any nation fighting a war, but particularly in the First World War, belligerent nations did not just require men to go and fight, right? They needed material to outfit massive armies. They needed food to feed them. They needed coal to power them. They needed rubber, steel, iron, and so on. And these demands brought enormous economic strains to each government, forcing European states to alter economic life, social organization, etc. The governments of combatant nations embraced a new concept called total war, and perhaps you've heard this term before. What it means is that all of the nation's resources, economic, material, human, etc., are directed towards the war effort itself, right? The war comes to dominate every aspect of life within the country. World War I was Europe's first total war. It meant that civilians' lives on the home front were completely reshaped, completely drawn into this experience. Indeed, the term home front illustrates the nature of total war, right? What is a front? Right? A front is a formation of armed forces. By its very nature, you would think that the home would not be a front, right? But in the First World War, it is. It's turned into one. To speak of a home front is to recognize civilians, all civilians, right? Here we see women, of course, and we've talked about that already, children, the elderly, all drawn into fighting the war in one way or another, even though they're not necessarily picking up rifles and they're not going into the trenches. And the idea of a home front, in short, it implies this thoroughgoing, totalizing mobilization of society. What was that like? How did that actually happen? Let's talk about a few examples. Belligerent governments quickly centralized their economies during the war. France, Germany, Britain, Austria, Russia. In each of these situations, and then later, once the US joins, they do this as well. Governments set up planning boards to regulate what the nation produced and what it consumed, right? So these planning boards are able to track essentially all of the materials and all of the productive capacity that exists within the country's borders. They impose price and wage controls, right? They stabilize the economy by saying there's no way you can charge more for this item, or there's no way that you can drop wages below this point. They introduce rations for individual and family consumption of goods. In other words, during World War I, the state, right, the government, played a much greater role in everyday life than it had, certainly in the sort of liberal states like Britain, but also even in the authoritarian states like Germany. As one German military leader put it, Germany could only win the war if all the treasures of our soil that agriculture and industry can produce are used exclusively for the conduct of war. All other considerations must come second. And I think even more precisely, all other considerations actually began to disappear. And we see similar efforts elsewhere, right? By 1916, Britain's economy, which is long the most liberal in Europe, and by that I mean the government has the least role in shaping economic development, um, has become centrally planned and regulated by the state. More than 200 British factories and 90% of all British imports were managed directly by the government. Um, what is a consequence of this? How does this change people's lives? Well, in a really basic sense, the things that people expect out of their economy are simply not there anymore, right? The choice, the freedom, the movement that might come from a more liberal economic arrangement disappear. Um, but another thing that begins to disappear is unemployment. As we saw in our reading, this was particularly significant for women all across Europe. Women are filling vacancies created by this exodus of men into the armed forces. Um, they build munitions. What else are they doing? They're working on railroads. They're working as police officers. They're working as office clerks. They're working as streetcar conductors. Um, these women were making bricks in Wales in the United Kingdom. Here we have a streetcar conductor, of course. Really, they're working in literally any area of civilian life, and many areas actually of military life back on the home front. But the ideal of separate spheres was not broken entirely by the war. It might have seemed like that to some extent in some of our reading, some of our discussions, that Victorian ideal that women, at least middle and upper middle class women, would stay in the home forever, and men would go out and into the public and earn the family's wages, etc. That ideal doesn't necessarily disappear. And we know this because once men begin returning from the Western Front, the women were largely just given a couple weeks' pay and a train ticket back home, right? They had to vacate these positions that they'd assumed and proven themselves in really quickly. That doesn't mean that nothing changed, though. There are legacies that come from what is essentially an experiment in industrial labor. And what we see almost immediately after the war is women carving out new spaces in public life, new political powers that they had never had before. Um, the most obvious example of this is that in Germany, Britain, Austria, and in the United States, all by the early 1920s, women have gained the right to vote. And it's not an accident that that happened almost immediately after the war. As one prominent English feminist put it, the war revolutionized the position of women. It found them serfs and it set them free. It found them serfs, right, tied to one place, unfree people, and it set them free. I'll come back to that in a second. In addition to government control over the economy, total war demanded that government regulate the production of ideas. There's a need, an intense demand that the government regulate how people think about the war effort. It has to silence criticism, silence dissent, in order to produce citizens who want to support the war. In Britain, in the early days of the war, Parliament passed what was called the Defense of the Realm Act, which demanded that no person shall, by word of mouth or in writing, spread reports likely to cause disaffection or alarm among any of His Majesty's forces or among the civilian population. So what does this law actually do? It gives the British government license to seize, for example, not only things like newspapers and magazines that might be criticizing the war, but to seize private correspondence. So there are British government censors who read literally the entire country's mail, and they will drop in helpful little letters sometimes to the sender of the mail, pointing out an offending passage, pointing out sensitive information that may have been included, and asking the sender to delete it and then send the mail again. So this is one of the ways that the British government is censoring ideas is shaping literally individuals' conversations with one another in order to ensure widespread support for the war. What else can they do? They can seize land, they can seize buildings, they can seize other property, censor the press, ban any speech, certainly public speech, that's critical of any of these decisions, right? Not just of military decisions out on the front, but literally anything that the government deems in the interest of the war effort. And this is happening all across Europe. And then it happens in the United States as well once the US enters the war. That's a story for another class, I suppose. It's with these efforts in mind that we can claim the First World War witnesses the birth of propaganda. Okay, propaganda is an essential tool of governments in the 20th century, and it had existed in some form or other at other points in history, but it is an extremely sophisticated tool beginning in the First World War, and it's widespread and it's common. Propaganda, I think, is a somewhat misunderstood concept. I think there's a sense that what it means is a sort of official lie. But propaganda does not necessarily have to be a lie. It's not necessarily untrue, right? Propaganda's root word is propagate, which means to spread, to diffuse. And what makes something propaganda is not the degree to which it is true or not, but the degree to which it is publicized by a mass audience in order to convince that mass audience to follow a certain behavior or to believe a certain idea. So during the war, what we see is this widespread propagation of state-sponsored messages and ideologies. So let's take a look at some of these. Here we have British propaganda, of course, Lord Kitchener, the British Secretary of State for War, urging young volunteers to join. Britain's, your country's army wants you. Another similar strategy here. How will you contribute, right? What will your role be? So this is a strategy of much of this propaganda, is to be very individualistic, which is difficult to do when you're sending the message to literally millions of people, but sort of make it personal, okay? Point directly in the face of the viewer and ask them why they have not signed up to support the war yet, why they aren't participating. Why are they off to the side? Like this guy you see here over in the bottom right of this image. Are you in this? All of these other people are in it. There's a little boy, right? There are women, there's nurses, there's women working on the home front, there's men working in factories. But then there's this guy. Is he in it? Right? No one wants to be that guy left out. Here we have a German poster that uses almost exactly the same strategy, right? Und dir. And you, right? Another common strategy you see is sort of gender shaming, using gender norms to encourage men to be manly, right? So here we have state-sponsored ideology, not only to get people to support the war, but states sponsoring the ideology of certain gender ideals, right? Real men should want to go and fight. Real men must be more manly than women, and yet we know that women support the war. So we have a British poster for the people of Ireland. For the glory of Ireland, will you go or must I? And then just across the Irish Sea, the women of Britain say, go, right? And then sort of along similar lines, my favorite, this is a sort of Freudian approach, using children or even the very idea of children as well as that kind of gender ideology to encourage men to join up, to enlist, or else someday you may be ashamed of yourself, right? Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? This little boy asks as he plays with toy soldiers, or this little girl asks perhaps as she reads a book about the war. And who would want to tell their children that they missed the war, that they never volunteered? And we see other strategies as well that harken back to some of the things that we've talked about earlier in the class. Here's German propaganda that plays up the sort of romantic nationalist ideals. Those are still very important in Europe at the time of the First World War. And this poster says, "Your fatherland is in danger, register," right? The idea of the fatherland, it's reminiscent of La Marseillaise, that French national anthem from the French Revolution that we talked about a month ago, right? Your country is literally your parent. So you have an obligation, a deep obligation in your very blood, to go and defend the fatherland or the motherland. And then one other approach is sort of turning that idea on the head, and also sort of reminiscent of La Marseillaise, which is to depict the enemies as sort of ferocious monsters who will come, they will kill us, right? They will take our women, they will murder our children, they will seize our land that is ours, right? So this is a French poster depicting a German soldier as the ferocious beast who feels hunger coming. We have to stop him. Posters like these were ubiquitous. They were everywhere. They appeared in public spaces like street corners, schoolrooms, bus stops, trolleys, and this propaganda aims to cultivate love for the nation, a sense of personal responsibility for the nation's well-being, hatred for the enemy, but also self-guilt, also a sense of gendered identity. All of these things play into the ways that European governments encourage their citizens to support the war effort. So what we see on the home front, just to sort of wrap up this section of the lecture, at least in Western Europe, is that in the interest of winning the war, the delicate balance between the rights of citizens and the power of the state is shifting pretty decisively towards the state. And this is a theme we're going to continue to talk about for much of the rest of the class. This is one of the major developments in the 20th century. In the 19th century, we saw states beginning to consolidate. We saw states trying to strike a balance of power in Western Europe. What we're going to see in the 20th century, especially beginning with the First World War up through the Second World War, is states beginning to eliminate the difference between themselves and their citizens. Okay, completely blur those boundaries or just eradicate those boundaries, turning each citizen into the sort of the human material of the state. But we'll get into that in much greater detail when we talk about Stalinism, when we talk about fascism. But along those lines, let's talk about one of the most important developments of the entire 20th century, and certainly one of the most important outcomes of the First World War, which is the Russian Revolution. Russia, as we know, was one of the key belligerents of the war, as a member of the Triple Entente with Britain and France. So they're at war with Germany. As you may know, the Russian government, as it was when the war began, did not survive the war. It was toppled in 1917, a victim of one of world history's great revolutionary uprisings, right there with the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Iranian Revolution of the 1970s. But before we explore 1917, which I'll do in just a second, I want to discuss the social and political context of Russia before the war. We really haven't talked about Russia very much yet in this class. It's actually a great irony and a very surprising development that Russia was the major European country to succumb to socialist revolution. Marx himself, Marx and Engels, believed revolution would come to Russia very late, very, very late, that Russia would surely be one of the last countries in Europe to fall to socialism. They believed that revolution would happen in Germany or in Britain, right? Heavily industrialized countries with a big proletariat, big working class, who is going to bring the revolution about. For most of the 19th century, Russia was just about the least industrial major power in Europe. 75% of its population in the 19th century were peasants. But Russia, after 1900, began a program of industrialization that was pretty quick. There were more than 4 million industrial workers there by World War I. So they're moving into becoming an industrial power. After the Russian Revolution in the 1920s, we're going to see especially during the 1920s and 1930s, you're going to see the Soviet Union, which comes out of the Russian Revolution, industrialize with breakneck rapidity. But that's a story for a couple weeks from now. So Russia before the war is an autocracy. That means it's ruled by a single figure, the Tsar. This is the Tsar Nicholas II at the time of the First World War. Nicholas's family had been in power. The Romanov family had been in power for more than 300 years. The big political transformations that we've been talking about for most of this class really had not taken root in Russia's political culture. The middle class bourgeoisie, who is so powerful everywhere else in Europe, they don't really have any power. They're very small. There are no elections in Russia. There's no representative governance. There's certainly no free press. All of the political power in the country does rest within this single figure here, Nicholas, the Tsar. So in a sense, Russia in 1914 is much more like France under Louis XIV in, say, the year 1680, France at the turn of the 18th century, than it is like Britain, France, or Germany at the time of the First World War. Okay, it's not really a 20th century society in many ways, certainly not politically. That does not mean, though, that the Russian people were unaware of or did not understand political developments outside of their own borders. In fact, you could say that in part because Russia's society was so repressive, would-be reformers, right, the people who might have called for, at another time, free elections, a free press, these sort of liberal reforms, became quite radical. And Russia, from the late 19th century, obviously up through the revolution, has this great revolutionary tradition, this great radical tradition. And many of the most important radical theorists of the late 19th century actually come from Russia. So it's fertile ground for anarchists. This is Mikhail Bakunin, who is probably the most famous anarchist of the late 19th and early 20th century. Pyotr Lavrov, who was a sort of populist reformer. We have Vera Figner and Sergei Nechayev, who were terrorists, right? Bomb-throwing terrorists, radical terrorists who tried to demolish the Russian state. With all of this in mind, it's not surprising that Karl Marx's writings found an extremely enthusiastic readership in Russia. Marx's works were translated into Russian quite early, earlier than many other languages, and many young readers found in Marx a sort of key, a way of understanding everything that was very clear, right? Which is what people continue to find appealing about Marxism. One of these early readers was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, born in the town of Simbirsk, which is, I don't know how many miles, but very far east of Moscow. Okay, this is not necessarily the center of Russian power. It's a fairly obscure place. It's out on the Volga River. He's born in 1870, and he was born to an upper middle class family, a comfortable family. Like many radicals, later in life, he would adopt a pseudonym, and he began calling himself Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was drawn to Marx in particular for many of the reasons we discussed a few weeks ago, right? Marxism offers this kind of confident, clear vision of historical progress. It's hopeful, right? There's a comforting assurance that the future is going to be better than the present. here's Lenin. Obviously, this is him. His face stands out. Um, this is him around the age of 27 with a secret Marxist reading group. Soon after this picture was taken, uh, Lenin and many of his comrades were sent to Siberia to a sort of prison exile for political sedition, which is a reminder to us that Russia under the Romanov regime was an incredibly repressive place. After his release, Lenin lived in exile in Europe for the next 17 years. So he did not return to Russia, actually, and he did not return to the sort of cosmopolitan hubs of Russia for nearly 2 decades. He was away. And throughout this period, Lenin tweaked Marxist theory to fit the Russian context. He thought constantly about what revolution would look like in Russia and how Marxism could be applied to Russia's sort of unique political economy, unique culture. And what he developed was his own political program called Marxism-Leninism. Um, and you don't need to know all of the details about how this differentiates itself from Marxism, but there's this one really important change, which is Lenin emphasizes the role of the party, is how he would put it. Lenin did not share Marx's confidence that the working class was simply going to rise up and bring about revolution itself. He had worked in factories, he had spent a lot of time around the working class, and he distrusted actually many working people. He distrusted their radicalism. So what he believed was that you needed a tight-knit party. You needed professional revolutionaries, people who dedicated themselves only to revolution, to lead workers into the revolution, to topple the state. So the basic point of Marxism-Leninism is that the party must be the vanguard of the revolution. And we're going to see this throughout the entire history of the Soviet Union. The party is where all the power really is. And Lenin and his supporters called their party the Bolshevik Party. So prior to 1914, what we have is this guy and men like those surrounding him here, living all across Western Europe. Lenin spends most of this period in Switzerland, thinking a lot about what revolution could be like in Russia with no real hope of ever accomplishing it. And there are points in this period where Lenin sort of resigns himself to the fact that another generation will be the one to actually accomplish these dreams. But then, of course, the First World War happens. And the First World War is a total miracle for the Bolsheviks. This was the opportunity that they could only have dreamed of before, an opportunity for the Russian state to grow vulnerable, to expose itself. And that it did, right? From the start, the war was a disaster for Russia. Economic hardship and military defeat defined the Russian experience in the First World War. By 1916, almost all ordinary Russians resent the war. They don't support it in the way that the British or the French or the Germans do. In January of 1917, more than 100,000 workers in the Russian capital city of Petrograd, today we call it St. Petersburg, went on strike. And by February, 80% of the city's workers were on strike. So there's essentially a complete economic shutdown in the national capital, the most important city. The general public then joins the strikers. They're chanting, "Down with the Tsar, down with the war," and they demand the distribution of bread. The Tsar, meanwhile, is out on the Eastern Front. He made the choice to lead his troops into battle, which was a mistake because he was not a skilled military commander, and he was to a significant extent responsible for the poor military performance of the Russian army during the war. he is out on the front, and all of this is happening. He is losing his capital, essentially. He calls in troops from the front to stifle the riots. And this is the disastrous moment when it turns out that the troops actually support the rioters as well. So now the soldiers, the workers, and the general public have announced their support for a revolution. An eyewitness, if this sounds familiar to you, based on what we've talked about in this class, it did to other folks at the time as well. An eyewitness proclaimed later that Petrograd in 1917 looked like Paris in 1789. Right? We talked about the storming of the Bastille. We talked about the tennis court oath. These are the sorts of developments that are happening in this winter of 1917 in Petrograd. So Nicholas loses control of power, just like Louis XVI had over a century before. He abdicates the throne, which ends the Romanov dynasty's 304 years in charge in Russia, their 304-year reign. And in the following year, similar to the Bourbons, to Louis's family, the entire Romanov family was executed by the Bolsheviks. So during the spring of 1917, a new government comprised of socialists and liberals comes to power temporarily until national elections can establish a permanent government. This is this crowd. They call themselves the Provisional Government. Their leader is a man named Alexander Kerensky. He's right here. Kerensky, not to give you a spoiler here, but he is not well liked by the Bolsheviks, and he ends up spending most of the rest of his life in the United States. Anyway, so the so-called provisional government is really not supported by the masses. Peasants, radical industrial workers don't really care for the kind of liberal ideals offered by the provisional government. Again, this is very similar to the transition from this kind of liberal reformist era of the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, etc., into the radical phase, except it's compressed into just a matter of a couple months. It's totally unable to address workers' demands, peasants' demands, and soldiers' demands, right? The provisional government says we're going to keep fighting the war. This was a fatal mistake, a terrible mistake. There's deep dissatisfaction with the war. There's 2 million Russian soldiers have deserted. Here they are. They're walking through the streets with a banner that says communism. Okay, the war for Russia is over, but the provisional government wants to keep up the fight. So peasants and soldiers and workers begin forming their own local assemblies. And these local assemblies are essentially the governing bodies of Russia, and they are called Soviets. Okay, so a Soviet is a small assembly that can make decisions for local people, and then the Soviets can work in conjunction with one another. It's almost like town governments in a way, right? Except they represent people of distinct classes. These hundreds of Soviets clash with the provisional government for power throughout the summer, and into this disastrously explosive situation comes Vladimir Lenin. He's been away for nearly 2 decades, but everybody knows who he is. His writings are well known in the sort of Russian underground. Here's a question. We've talked about the disaster of World War I on the landscape of Central Europe, right? How could this guy have gotten from Switzerland all the way to Russia on a train in the middle of the war? How could that have happened? Well, what happened was the German army put him on a train. They knew where he was. They knew who he was. They knew what kind of discord he might sow if they injected him into the population of Russia. They're one of their key enemies in the war. So they put him on this private train. They seal up the train, and they send it north. It runs through Germany and then across up all the way north of Sweden and then down through Finland and delivers him to Finland station in the spring of 1917. And upon his arrival, Lenin proclaims that the Bolsheviks will not cooperate with the provisional government. It's exactly the kind of discord that the Germans had in mind. It's kind of an insane plan on their part, and it actually works out, at least in a very short-sighted way, very well. I have a feeling that they have their doubts looking back later on. Lenin demands land, peace, and bread, which becomes the Bolshevik mantra. The Bolsheviks are speaking to class-based demands, class-based resentments. This is the kind of rhetoric that radical elements in Russian society, which is a lot of people in 1917, really care about. They don't care about national identity. They don't care about national honor and fighting the war and holding up their end of the bargain. They certainly don't care about a free press. They certainly don't care about freedom of speech or free markets. They want land, they want peace, and they want bread. By August, the Bolsheviks are the dominant party in Russia, by far the most powerful party in the country. They have 200,000 active members, right? Remember, Lenin believes the party is the vanguard of the revolution, and he has created a very powerful and very popular party. Okay, this is exactly as he had theorized it happening. In October, they've had enough, and with soldiers across the country, these soldiers are known as the Red Guards, they begin to capture important sites of power. They capture most of Petrograd. It's essentially bloodless, and it's known as the October Revolution, also known as the Bolshevik Revolution. Okay, so there's two revolutions in Russia in 1917. That first one is this kind of popular uprising that simply topples the Tsar. The provisional government takes power, is unable to maintain power for the rest of the year. Revolution number two, the Bolsheviks seize power. And a civil war will ensue. I'm not going to go into great detail about the Civil War, but it will last several years, and it's going to be incredibly bloody. And there will be czarist factions, and there'll be some liberal factions. There's going to be soldiers who were fighting, who did support the war effort, and they're going to turn on the Bolshevik government. The Bolsheviks will face them. It's going to be ferocious. Lenin and company claim that they're taking power on behalf of the Soviets, those small local assemblies of workers, of soldiers, of peasants. And they immediately proclaim that Russia is a socialist republic. Okay, this is the first, actually, in the history of the world. And this new Russian Socialist Republic in 1922 is renamed in a way that fits with these local assemblies, these Soviets, and it is called the Soviet Union, right? The union of all of these local assemblies is what makes up the Soviet nation, and it will bear that name until it collapses in 1991. In the earliest days after the revolution, the Bolshevik government abolished all social titles. They abolished military ranks. This is the kind of anti-hierarchical thinking that we saw during the French Revolution. The abolition of titles, the abolition of social rank, the abolition of estates in the French Revolution. Hereafter, all men and women were addressed simply as citizen. If you were a member of the party, you were addressed as comrade. They nationalized the means of production, railroads, banks, factories, land, all becomes national property. There is no more private property. They eliminate the role of church and government, and then they'll increasingly eliminate churches and any sort of religious presence in the country entirely. And they decree absolute equality of the sexes. Okay, so it's egalitarian, it's secular, and it is socialist, right? Nationalizing the means of production. But the Bolsheviks weren't going to be able to simply wield power with good ideas. And they are an incredibly violent party, an aggressive party that will do what they deem necessary. to protect the revolution. Lenin's Russia was a one-party state, and it was modeled very intentionally. You're going to notice a lot of similarities here with the Jacobins of the French Revolution's radical phase from about 1792 to 94. And like the Jacobins, the Bolsheviks were going to spill blood. As they put it, they would defend the revolution. And they would also defend their dream of building socialism, is how they put it. They had a committee that was in charge of this. So in the French Revolution, we talked about the Committee of Public Safety. There's something similar here. For the Bolsheviks, it's called the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution. The Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution. Its Russian initials were CHEKA, or Cheka. And the Cheka is the Bolshevik secret police. They punish counter-revolutionaries. So they go out and they arrest, or they simply murder, czarists, right? People who were loyal to the Romanov family, even though they're gone, priests, landowners, nobles, liberals, socialists. As the Bolsheviks advance a much more extreme, radical vision of the state, there's a lot of socialists who dissent from what they're offering, so they become as well enemies of the state. Anyone who could be deemed a threat to the revolution simply by existing. Again, they're drawing on the Jacobins' extremism. In the years after 1917, the Cheka tortured or killed tens of thousands, far more victims than the French Reign of Terror. And this bloodletting intensifies massively, almost beyond belief, later on, right, in the 1920s, and especially in the 1930s, a period known as the Great Terror under Stalin. We're going to discuss that later. My point, though, is that brutality was always part of Soviet governance. Violence was always a tool of governance in Soviet society. It's not like Stalin was some sort of aberration in that he adopted that tool. This is happening from the very start. Stalin intensifies it, he scales it up almost beyond belief, but he did not invent it. Western Europeans are watching this closely. This is one of the major events in the history of the world, and everybody can recognize it quickly. It's a terrifying moment. It's an exhilarating moment. If you're a socialist elsewhere in the world, if you're an intellectual, if you're an industrial worker, you find great hope in the Russian Revolution. You see this as a wonderful development. For conservatives, for many liberals, who have a vested interest in systems that the Bolsheviks want to destroy, the Russian Revolution was a nightmare. It was the spark for a number of strategies to silence left-wing political dissent in the 1920s, including the extremist politics of fascism. Okay. Before we get to fascism, though, before we get to some of that repression in non-socialist societies, we need to talk about how the war ended. So I'm going to move as quickly as I can here. The war officially ended on November 11th, 1918. 2 months later, the belligerent nations, representatives from 32 nations totally, convened in Paris to determine the conditions of peace. Super high expectations going into the convention. As one British diplomat put it, we were preparing not peace only, but eternal peace. I mean, if you think back to what we read just 2 weeks ago and how excited Europeans were for the coming of war, the absolute jubilation that met the coming of war in August 1914, and now we are in the winter of 1919, half a decade later, and they're ready for eternal peace forever. It suggests just how scarring the war effort was, how brutal it was. Representatives come from China, Japan, throughout the Middle East, Latin America, Southeast Asia. There's a delegation of Jewish leaders who come with an idea for forming a Jewish state in British-controlled Palestine, which obviously will come to fruition much later, only after the Holocaust in the 1940s. The members of the Central Powers, however, Germany, Austria-Hungary, were not invited. So the leaders of the newly formed German Republic, remember the German Empire had collapsed at the end of the war, the German Republic can only sit on the sideline and hope that the final terms are going to be merciful, and they won't be. Despite all this diversity, the final terms were primarily determined by actually 3 countries. People talk of a big 4, which would include Italy, but really there's 3 power players at the peace conference. There's the United States, represented by President Woodrow Wilson over here on the right. There is France, represented by President George Clemenceau, and there's Britain, represented by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, far left. This guy here next to Lloyd George is Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, he's Prime Minister of Italy. Italy joined the Triple Entente during the war. So Wilson was really the star of the show. Wilson is really the center of attention. He makes it clear he wants a peace settlement based on liberal democratic ideals. He's such an idealist. He's got a grand vision for world affairs that can come out of this peace. Wilson is like the opposite of realpolitik, which we had talked about a few weeks ago. He doesn't want to deal with the world as it is. Okay, he sets a goal for the future, the world as it could be, and he begins imagining what it'll take to get there. He is, in a sense, a classic American liberal. He's a classic American idealist who thinks world affairs can simply be made better. And the larger presence that the U.S. has in those affairs, the better off for everybody. He summed up his vision with his 14 points. You may have heard of this before. This is the thesis that he brings with him to Versailles. And the core idea of the 14 points is that national communities have a right to sovereign states. So this is an idea, you'll remember, that stretches back to the Romantic nationalists of the early 19th century. And it's wildly popular among colonized peoples. That is, national communities that are governed by distant empires. So Poles, Ukrainians, Czechs, Hungarians, as well as people in France and Italy and Belgium who have members of their national community that are living within other borders. These people like this idea, right? That's why Wilson is so celebrated. Anyone really who's lost territory to Germany or Austria finds something to support in the 14 points. So the basic point here is that Wilson wants to redraw the map of the world. If he can't quite do that, then he's going to try to redraw the map of Europe. And he wants to replace empires with independent, nationally homogeneous, democratic nation states. And Wilson also wants to treat Germany delicately. Peace without victory, that's his slogan, peace without victory. All Europeans can work together, they can build a more equitable situation, right? They can move past the violence of the war towards a better future. Wilson has all of these kind of Enlightenment ideals, right? You might see that popping through: internationalism, universalism, reason, right? He's saying, look, if we're just being reasonable, if we're not working from our passion, if we're just thinking reasonably, we can see that there's a better future available to all of us, and we don't have to do this again. So to him, it's kind of common sense. To the other members of the convention, it is not. Okay, they don't share his idealism. We're talking about millions of deaths. We're talking about the absolute destruction of the landscape. We're talking about costs that are almost unimaginable. The French population is reduced by 11%, 11% killed or wounded. More than 50% of France's men of fighting age were killed. 50%. They don't really want to hear about peace without victory. They need victory. So the British, and especially the French, they want revenge. And again, that revenge, that need for revenge, it goes all the way back to the Franco-Prussian War. French Premier Clemenceau, he was this hardcore nationalist. He had lived through the Franco-Prussian War. He remembered it. He was known as the Old Tiger. And he once proclaimed, in great contrast to Wilson's idea of peace without victory, he once proclaimed, "When I die, bury me deep, standing up and marching towards Germany." And he attributed the entire war to Germany's lust for power. Here we have an image of Clemenceau, the Old Tiger, capturing the German eagle. David Lloyd George, maybe not quite as intense, but still no fan of the Germans. He'd been reelected in 1918. He had his position at Versailles based on this election, in which he ran the campaign slogan, "Hang the Kaiser." And at Paris, he demanded the Germans just pay for the entire war. So both Clemenceau and George, they really pushed back against the 14 points. And the president would have to come around to their demands if he could achieve this other dream he has of creating a League of Nations. The League of Nations would be this new international body, again, built on Enlightenment ideals that can apply reason and justice to any international conflicts to prevent war like this from ever happening again. This is Wilson's ultimate dream. If he can achieve it, he's willing to allow Lloyd George and George Clemenceau to have their way with Germany. So the Allies stripped Germany of all overseas possessions. They restored the territory of Alsace-Lorraine to France. They carved Eastern Germany and the Northern Austrian Empire into new states, into the new state of Poland, rather. Germany's valuable Western coal region. Let me show you on a map here. This is better. Okay. Germany's valuable Western coal region, which is over here, there's the Saarland. It's going to be administered by France. This is Alsace-Lorraine, by the way. This is the region that's carved out and turned into Poland. And French and British troops are going to occupy the Rhineland right here, this incredibly rich sort of commercial and cultural heartland of Western Germany. French and British troops will occupy that for the next 15 years. So the German losses are quite staggering. Most infamously, Article 231 of the treaty formally blamed Germany and her allies for causing the war. So this is called the War Guilt Clause. And the Germans were going to have to pay reparations for the damage of the war. These would amount to about $55 billion. It would take decades to repay. And to prevent the Germans from simply mobilizing a military again, the treaty reduced the size of the German military to 100,000 soldiers, no air force, virtually no navy. And the Germans really don't have much choice but to sign. They're powerless to resist this. And so in the Versailles Hall of Mirrors, exactly the same place where the German Empire had been decreed 40 years earlier, Kaiser Wilhelm had done that. The Germans now are forced to accept the death of their empire and this extremely burdensome treaty. So Europe after World War I is a dramatically different place than it was before. The Russian Empire has collapsed, and in its place, the Bolshevik socialist government is concentrating power. In the place of the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire, there's all these new independent nation states. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia brings together the diverse Slavic peoples of Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, which we had talked about in the lead up to World War I. Wilson does briefly achieve his League of Nations to try and maintain peace among all of these diverse independent nation states. But the US Congress, which is not led by Wilson's Democratic Party, it's led by isolationist Republican Party that wants nothing to do with world affairs. They want nothing to do with war. They actually vote to keep the U.S. out of the League, which is a stunning rebuke to the president, and sort of destroys his legacy. Germany is unable to join the League of Nations. So the League has no real power. It has no ability to actually diffuse any conflict, and it's going to collapse in a matter of years. Where does this leave us? What's the state of affairs? It's sort of an unsatisfying ending to this grand calamitous war. One French general captured the mood on the continent after the war like this. He said that the Treaty of Versailles was not a treaty at all, but a ceasefire. Right? And we know that if something is a ceasefire, there will be an unceasing of the fire. There will be more fighting to come. Germans are stewing. They universally despise the Treaty of Versailles. They look for people to blame for their humiliation, for their economic suffering, for their great personal suffering, and they are going to increasingly turn to a politics that feeds on that blame and resentment, right? Right-wing militaristic politics that will allow them to turn their blame on people within their own borders, of course, as well as on the nations that foisted this unhappy peace upon them. And in the next lecture, we're going to turn to that very story. Okay, thanks for watching, everybody.